Hello, and welcome once more to a conversation with myself, Mark Vernon, and Rupert Spira. Hi there, Rupert.
Hello, Mark. Lovely to see you and be talking with you again.
It is, and I really hope that we can develop some of the themes and connections that we were making last time. Um, but I thought I'd kick off with a bit of William Blake just to kind of get us going,
It's a very
because
good place to start.
this conversation is going to be around the common theme, which is often known as non-dualism, of course. And I was reading some Blake recently and caught a phrase that he uses that seemed to capture it very well from the Christian tradition, when at the end of his poem, wonderfully titled Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Giant Albion, he says that Jesus himself appeared to him and said, "Awake, awake, O sleeper of the land of shadows, wake, expand. I am in you and you in me, mutual in love divine. I am not a god afar off, I am a brother and friend. Within your bosoms I reside, and you reside in me. Lo, we are one." And I love that sense of the awakening coming closer and closer to that final "lo, we are one."
It couldn't get much clearer than that.
Yeah, I really think that that's true. And part of the reason why I enjoyed our conversation last time and was hoping to pick up on things again is that, these dialogues can help tease things out, well, for myself, but I hope for those listening, and bring not just experience, but what people like Blake and others were keen to bring as well, which is insight, intelligence, kind of wisdom, which I feel is really valuable, again, to myself, but I hope to others right now, thinking about this theme of "lo, we are one." I guess that is a situation you recognize as well, because I know that it's a big part of what you offer with not only retreats and meditations, but the question and answer to conversations as well.
Yes, yes. It's the lo we are one. It is the essence of the non-dual understanding, and that is it is the essence of all the great religious and spiritual traditions. That although life appears to us as a multiplicity and diversity of objects and selves, behind that appearance and as an expression of it or as an appearance of it, that there is a single, infinite, and indivisible whole or reality from which everyone and everything derives its apparently independent existence. That is really the entire spiritual tradition, religious tradition, in a nutshell. And all that requires is for us to understand this, to feel this, and to lead a life to the best of our ability in a way that is consistent with and an expression of this understanding.
Yeah,
Blake
well,
puts it beautifully.
yeah. I mean, the poem it's a long, long poem. It's one of his epics, and it goes through all these twists and turns, which in a way, in effect, explore the separate self, even the separate self to the point that it feels it's died. And then there's the awakening, which I guess is mirrors what often brings people to seek out this understanding. They've been through all sorts of twists and turns, often on spiritual paths, actually. But then, almost when they've had enough, sometimes it needn't be like this, of course, but almost when they've had enough, there's this kind of awakening. Certainly, Blake seems to have known that.
Yes, for the vast majority of people, the vast majority of people approach this the non-dual understanding in one tradition or another, in an attempt to be free of suffering. I, having been kind of speaking publicly about these matters for 12 or so years, I would say that the two reasons why people may approach this understanding is one through suffering and one through intelligence. But by intelligence, I mean asking a question such as, what is the nature of reality? So a few come through that route, a philosophical route, but 95% come because they're suffering. They've tried through objects, substances, activities, relationships, and so on, to get rid of their suffering. That they failed. They don't have anywhere else to turn. And at some point, the religious or spiritual possibility becomes available to them. So it's simply like the prodigal son. He had got to the end of his tether. There was nothing else in the world, nowhere else for him to go. And as a result of that, there was this turning around, this conversion in him. Well, most of us don't need to go quite that far, although some do have to go to the brink of despair before they turn around. But the vast majority of us begin to approach this understanding because our suffering is unbearable and we cannot find relief for it anywhere else.
Yeah. So look, I want to pick up on this theme of suffering, and I always feel it's worth being a little cautious about it because, you know, suffering really is suffering and people really do struggle and on occasion do come to the brink of despair as well. But there's such good news, again, to use a rather Christian expression, buried within it that I wanted to tease out in the first part of our conversation now, which might be called, in a way, the inversion of suffering. Because what I've noticed, both reading texts, actually not just in the Christian tradition, but in the Sufi tradition as well, and then, of course, reflecting on one's own experience, is that there's a kind of turnaround which you begin to sense and then can become the norm in suffering, where, well, Blake calls it when the furnaces of affliction turn into fountains of living water. And it's the experience, I think, that you see in certainly in the Sufi traditions, saying great texts like Attar's The Conference of the Birds. Yes. You know, it's full of stories of actual sort of seeming Sufi adepts that come unstuck, almost, it seems, when they've arrived. And yet that moment becomes absolutely crucial for completing their sense, because the suffering becomes the opportunity to know of the separation, but knowing also that it's overcome. There's some kind of perception where the two things come together. And I've heard you recently say, actually, of a Christian leading advocate of meditation in the Christian tradition, Brother Lawrence, that sometimes he would almost pray for suffering because then he knew of the depths of his unity with the divine. Now, one has to say this very carefully because it's not masochistic. It is, though, born out of the realization that the unity can be complete and it can be known as complete. You talked about these things a lot. You know,
yes.
How does that make sense to you?
It makes a lot of sense, Mark. From the point of view of the separate self, suffering is something we want to get rid of, we want to get away from. But from the point of view of the true and only self, the presence of awareness, or in religious language, God's presence, suffering can be seen as the pull, or the gravitational pull on the apparently separate self from its true nature. So although we as apparently separate selves see suffering as a negative thing, something to be got rid of, something to be overcome, it is in fact what pulls us towards our true nature. In fact, of course, the separate self doesn't realize this, because the separate self feels, I am seeking happiness, I am trying to overcome my suffering. In fact, the separate self, ultimately speaking, that there is no separate self. That the actor John Smith, who plays the part of King Lear feels that he is doing everything, that King Lear is not doing anything, that there is no character called King Lear. It is John Smith who is veiling himself with his own activity and then attracts the apparent character of King Lear back to himself. So what King Lear feels as the search for happiness, or my search to overcome my suffering, is in fact John Smith attracting the apparently separate self back to himself. So I would agree. Sometimes I phrase it in religious language. Our longing for God is God's love for us. We feel, I am longing for God. I, the separate self, am longing for God. I am trying to find happiness. No, that there is no separate I. It is God's love that is attracting us, the apparently separate self, back to itself. And for this reason, as you say, Brother Lawrence, there's one very beautiful passage in his book where he remonstrates with God for allowing him to be happy, because in his happiness, he forgets God. He feels the pull of God's presence in his unhappiness. And he says, God, I would rather be unhappy in hell with you than to be happy in heaven without you. Of course, it doesn't quite make sense, but he's trying to convey that he feels the pull of God's presence in his suffering, and his suffering is as such sweet to him. And exactly the same, the Shankaracharya had a student, a disciple called Kunti, who had one prayer in her life: Lord, give me some adversity, because it is only in adversity that I remember you. So there is this deep intuition in us that in our suffering is contained this kernel of light, that this God's presence pulling us back to itself, if we can frame it in religious language.
Yeah, I see that in, I mean, a quote from Rumi, actually, which again is very illuminating. And I know you used the quote about flowing down and down into ever widening rings of being. And it comes at the end of a poem, which actually is about suffering, about worry, about possessiveness, and so on. But the turn almost that comes with that final couplet is the realization that, well, to switch to Christian language a bit, it's in the moment of weakness and letting go, surrender, maybe would be a more Islamic word, that the realization that there's a greater good that can encompass all that seems bad, or a greater love that can encompass all that seems hateful. Blake talks about eternal life that can embrace even what he calls eternal death. And I think by that he's just underlying the moment of realization.
Yes, absolutely, Mark. It's a letting go. It's a letting go of any kind of anything that limits us. That is why Rumi says, flow down and down in ever widening rings of being. What he means by flowing down is going deeper and deeper into our self, allowing ourselves to be divested of all the limiting characteristics and qualities that we inherit from the content of our experience. And in other words, we sort of undress. Our being is unveiled as we sink deeper and deeper into ourself. And as there is this letting go of the content of experience, of our limitations, and our being grows wider. It loses its limitations and eventually stands revealed as infinite being, or in religious language, as God's being. In other words, that ultimately God's presence is God's being is the only being there is, and God's being shines in us as our essential self or being, and in that being is clothed in human experience and seems to become limited. And suffering is for many people that the means by which we let go of everything we're attached to, everything. It's a letting go and hence a widening of our being.
Yeah, it's good to hear. And I partly wanted to sort of begin with this because I feel that we live in a time where there's a lot of suffering, and there always has been, but it's talked about publicly a lot because of the pandemic. And yet it often feels like this element isn't much aired. And so I hope it's support and encouragement to people. That almost moment by moment, I think it's possible to develop this habit where when you feel even a slight restlessness, let alone something that's much more anxiety provoking, it's possible to take that step back and to realize the fullness of being within which everything is occurring. I mean, we've talked about Rumi, you mentioned Rumi, and of course, there's this famous relationship in his life where Shams leaves him in order to leave him in the divine
Yes.
being, I guess. And there's a parallel in Dante's Divine Comedy, actually, where at the top of Mount Purgatory, when you think he's about to launch into paradise and everything is going to be plain sailing from here, Beatrice appears and reproaches him for 2 cantos, which is quite a long time in Dante. And it's so powerful that even the angels are kind of going, look, give him a bit of love. He's been on a long journey, but Beatrice is saying, no, there's more. And so, yeah, there's a kind of encouragement in that as well, when it feels, like it's going to go on.
Yes, and there's a similar story, a true story from the end of Ramana Maharshi's life, when he was dying, and all his students and disciples were very upset because he was passing away, and he looked at them and he said, "But why are you crying? Why are you upset?" I'm paraphrasing him now. For 50 years, I've been trying to tell you that who I really am is who you really are. I'm not leaving you. There's nothing to be sad about. And in a way, his leaving, his death, for many people, is the letting go of their last and strongest attachment. And it was necessary in order to recognize that which they had projected outside of themselves in the form of the teacher was, in fact, their very own being. And I think a similar process happened with Rumi and Shams.
So, you mentioned death there. And again, I'm glad, because that was another area that I wanted to talk about, since apart from anything else, it feels like we live in a culture that is having to face death in a way that it hasn't had to in recent years with the pandemic, and again feels very under-resourced to do so in this kind of way. And perhaps I could just introduce this theme head on with some Blake again, because I think one of the things that Blake tries to communicate is that there are kind of different mentalities, different perceptions, and in different perceptions, death looks very, very different. So the one that he called Ulro, death looks like a statistic, and it's not even really felt much. It's just a kind of brute fact that's added up, with obvious parallels to much about the way death's taught now. It warms, it becomes a bit more heartfelt in the state that he called generation, where though death then becomes something to avoid at all costs, it can only be understood as a kind of terrible loss. And so people throw everything at it in order to avoid it. Then there's the third state, which he calls Beulah, where death is seen as deeply connected to love and as a tragedy, therefore, that can tear the heart. But there's something else he wants us to understand, which is this state he calls Eden eternity, which is, I think, when the glimpse is gained that, lo, we are one. And then death can become a pathway. And he captures this in phrases like, every kindness is a little death. And I think what he's suggesting is not somehow we should, but of course he's not saying this, that we should all just straightforwardly embrace death as if suicide somehow is the path. He's really not saying that. But what he's saying is that I think death can be sort of folded into, again, every moment, in order that it can become the way of life to release more and more of life. And then, death at the end of life, mortality, looks very, very different, because it's seen as something that's been embraced throughout life. I mean, another famous expression of this is T.S. Eliot's expression that the time of death is every moment. Now, I feel there's something really crucial in this that we might grasp now in our particular moment. But again, I wonder what sense that makes to you.
Yes, it makes a lot of sense, Mark. I think what people really fear is not death of the physical body. It's death of their sense of their identity. That's what is. That's what we fear to let go of. Our identity, our sense of ourself, and our sense of ourself is invested in objects, history, family, activities, relationships. We derive our sense of ourselves from all kinds of experiences, but none of these experiences are actually essential to ourself. Our essential self, the essential self, pure being, is prior to and independent of any experience, and that is the real death. This is what the Sufis mean when they speak of dying before we die, dying as the separate entity before the death of the body. And dying as a separate entity implies this recognition that what we essentially are is prior to and independent of the content of experience. But in order to recognize that, we have to let go of everything that is extraneous to us. And this is the real death. And this is something that our culture has really completely lost sight of, because our culture considers the self to be identical to the body. When we think of ourself, we think ourself is essentially the body inside which is a mind. So death to our identity is the body, and the death of the body means the death of ourself. This is the kind of standard view of death in our culture, but it's so far removed from the understanding of ourself that we find in all the wisdom traditions. And really the cure for the fear of death is the recognition of our essential nature. And so this is why, in one way or another, all the spiritual traditions suggest this dying before we die, this divesting of ourself of all the limitations that we inherit from experience, the limitations that are derived from our thoughts, feelings, activities, relationships, sensations, and so on. And this is the great secret, the great open secret that is contained in all the spiritual traditions. Before Abraham was, I am, this being that is prior to time, prior to experience, that exists, that is ever present in us, as us. So what seems to be a death from the point of view of the separate self is, in fact, as Blake would say, it is eternal life, it is eternity. But in order to recognize that which is eternal in us, we have to die to that which is temporal in us. Or we have to at least let it go. It doesn't need to be destroyed, but we need to let it go.
And I think that contemplating the nature of time, as you mentioned, that is another way of making this a practice that then transforms life in life, and so reveals some of these perceptions. I'm thinking here of, say, the difference between time experienced as clock time, chronos time, as it's sometimes put, and time experienced as kairos time, which is the meaningfulness of the moment. Again, and Blake actually, it's somewhere he says something like, clock time is full of folly, whereas wisdom knows the time of every moment. And it's feeling, I think, the pregnancy, the possibility, the potential, say, of every moment, to step into a new awareness, which is the true awareness, rather than just repeating the old habits, which in a way the ticking of the clock seems to almost encourage us to do. So, again, thinking about the direct path, sometimes I think that actually quite a good way of trying to cultivate the direct sense is to try and experience every moment in this sense of it becoming a wellspring for something new, if you can sense into the meaning of the moment, or just practice that little shift of virtue, every kindness,
yes.
And then you leaning into time revealing more and more of eternity, rather than it just going on and feeling like it might be running out.
Yes. It's interesting, Mark, if we ask ourselves, without reference to thought, is there any experience of time? It's difficult for us to imagine, but imagine now that we didn't have the faculty of thought. Would we know anything of time? There'd be no experience of time at all. I don't even mean to imply that there may not be memories. For instance, without thought, an image can come to us. But that image would come to us in the present, and without the ability to conceptualize our experience, let's say an image of dinner yesterday, without the ability to conceptualize our experience and compare our current experience with dinner yesterday, we would have no experience of an interval in time between our current experience and the memory of yesterday's dinner. So even memory is not by memory in this context, I mean an image that comes to us from the past without the interpretation of thought. So even an image from the past is not experiential evidence of time. The only experiential evidence there is for time is thought. So it's interesting to then to ask ourselves, do we really experience the time that thought conceptualizes? And we don't. Not obviously implying that it's not valid to conceptualize time. Of course it is. But the concept of time is one thing. But the belief that time is, as it is conceptualized, is real, is another thing. As a concept, time is necessary for everyday life, but actually there's no experiential evidence for it. And if we take, somebody says, but what about the fossil records of dinosaurs and everything? Time is a conceptual framework that thought has abstracted, that thought has made up in order to accommodate fossil records, but it's an interpretation of an experience. So it's the idea of, and because we filter our experience through thought. It's almost as if the mind was like a pair of glasses made out of thought and perception through which we perceive reality. But we forget that time, and I would even include space, are part of the conceptual framework, the conceptual architecture of our own minds. We forget that, and we presume that time and space are inherent qualities of reality. But it's interesting to notice that every time thought and perception come to an end, time and space come to an end. Every time thought and perception arise, time and space appears. There's obviously a close correlation between them. Could it be that thought and perception refract the eternal, infinite nature of reality and simply make it appear as time and space? Thought and perception, in other words, spread out eternity and make it appear as time. Spread out the dimensionless presence of awareness and make it appear as 3 dimensions of space. And this is in fact consistent with our experience. We all have an intuition of this, because when it's always now, and it's always here. we've never experienced then. We never experience over there. Even when we see something that's over there and we go to it, we experience it as here. So all experience is the here and now. The here and now is like it's like the vertical intersection of the horizontal dimension of time. It's the hint. The here and now are the hint in our waking state of the nature of reality. The here and now are the place where reality and the time and space that seem to be real in the waking state intersect. They are hints. They're portals, doorways. That's why the now is so important in the spiritual traditions. It's the portal through which we pass out of time into eternity. It's why the present moment is given so much importance in spiritual practice, because it is recognized as a kind of portal.
It's very fascinating because actually the way that time and space are mental constructs is taken as a basis for modern philosophy. So it's in Immanuel Kant, for example, and sometimes actually you mentioned the spectacles analogy, and sometimes that's used because it brings things into focus. But of course, what the spiritual traditions can offer, I think, and again, this is in Blake, is that thought and perception can be in the service of eternity, to sort of enjoy eternity. Absolutely. Or springing from eternity. And in fact, at the end of that poem again, he talks about fourfold vision, which is when life is known to be rooted in the one, creates space, creates time as kind of part of the dance of eternity, if you like. But it's completely reversed from what you're saying is the normal. Yeah.
Yes. And just while we're talking about Blake, the quote that you know very well, eternity is in love with the productions of time. He's here talking about a recognition, a realization where time, the objects of time, have lost their veiling power. It's what I sometimes refer to as the outward facing path, and all the faculties of thought and perception are still available. But they no longer veil their reality, but shine with it. So then thought, perception, all of these faculties are still available. But as you suggest, they're used in the service of truth. They're no longer used in the service of ignorance. They're used as expressions of truth. Hence, eternity is in love with the productions of time. Everything that is produced in apparent time is an emanation of and a celebration of eternity.
Yeah, and I think that another way of sort of feeling the difference is that this is space and time as spaces and times of freedom. You can sort of move, as it were, from the eternal to the moment in its different senses, rather than again time feeling like it traps us with its regularity, or space constrains us with its pinning us down. Liberty, you might say, is woven into this sense of the now, which again is why freedom is such an important part of the spiritual traditions. They really are offering the fullest kind of freedom.
Yes. This is why I sometimes refer to Blake as one of the great Tantric masters of the Western tradition, because in the Tantric tradition, they have this great respect for manifestation. Whereas in the inward-facing paths, for instance, the Vedantic tradition, there is more of an emphasis of turning away from the content of experience. The objects of time and space are considered to be distractions from reality. They veil reality. They take us away from reality, and that's valid. If we consider objects and selves to exist independently in their own right, then it's true that they do that emphasizes separation. So it is valid to turn away from them in the initial stages, but the Tantric tradition then turns back towards the content of experience, the objects, and no longer sees them as concealing reality, but sees them shining with reality. So that they have there's this beautiful understanding that it's not manifestation itself that is problematic. Manifestation is simply a manifestation of the one. There's nothing there apart from the one. But it's our belief, having overlooked the one, having forgotten about the one, then the 10,000 things seem to exist in their own. Everything seems to have its own independent existence, and this is a paradigm of separation, fragmentation, which inevitably leads to unhappiness on the inside and conflict on the outside. So, of course, it's valid to turn away initially from the content of experience, but in the Tantric traditions, and this is why I feel that Blake really belongs to that tradition. He goes back to manifestation, and you well know the quote about William Blake seeing the rising sun as a manifestation of the heavenly host, as a celebration of God's presence.
Yes, and I think this so matters culturally as well at the moment. And one way which I think makes sense is that we live in a culture that, because it's forgotten the nature of eternal perception, has slipped into the desire and the craving, the real terrible need to try and make heaven a place on earth. And I think that this drives so much consumption, so much using up of the material world, rather than seeing that earth is a place that can shine with heaven, and so have this kind of portal or door quality. I mean, I think one of the ways that Blake captures this, to try and make the point as clear as I can, is with this character Loss. And Loss is always kind of working hard to build Golgonooza in one of Blake's wonderful neologisms, and can seem like a sort of tragic figure, because Golgonooza always crumbles, it always falls. But actually what Loss realizes, and he's praised for holding on to the divine vision, as Blake puts it, is realizing that the act of building is to make the world capable of heaven once more, shining with heaven, rather than trying to bring somehow heaven down to earth. And so that's one of the ways that I think Blake brings together that which breaks can actually become a breaking in of something more. He's trying to show how we can live mortal lives, but becoming more and more transparent to the immortal by our actions, if you like, cultivating certain qualities or attitudes, perceptions, rather than feeling we've got to sort of pin it down, hold on, accumulate, yes, build more and more. Something like that, I think, really matters. Again, it's another kind of inversion.
Yes. I think the one simple understanding that has been lost in our culture, and that is responsible for the kind of consumerism and the attitude towards the earth that you mentioned, is just the simple understanding that we find in all the traditions, one way or another, that happiness or peace is the nature of our being. The only place it can be found is in our being. And this understanding is just lost from our culture. We are surrounded by influences that persuade us one way or another that in order that happiness requires the accumulation of the acquisition of some kind of object, substance, activity, relationship, and so on. And what's ironic is that, and the reason I think this is perpetuated generation after generation, is because when we do acquire the object, the substance, the relationship, and so on, we do experience happiness. But we wrongly interpret the cause of that happiness. What we don't realize is that the acquisition of the object brings an end to our seeking. In other words, it brings an end to the mind. There is a temporary cessation of the activity of the mind, because prior to the acquisition of the object, the mind's activity was seeking. So when we get the object, the seeking comes to an end. The mind comes briefly to an end. And our true nature of happiness, which was behind the mind all the time, briefly shines. And of course, the mind, which has no access to its background, wrongly attributes the happiness experienced to the object, activity, relationship, and so on that is acquired. And so hence the next cycle of seeking, acquisition, brief moment of happiness, these cycles go on and on and on, and eventually lead to addiction. We just don't understand in our culture that the happiness we experienced was not caused by the acquisition of the object or the substance or the activity. It was brought about because our mind was brought to an end. As a result of that, our innate happiness shone. And we just simply don't understand this in our culture. We believe that it is the object that causes the happiness. And once we believe that, then this really determines the whole trajectory of our life.
Yeah, I think, and that's such a brilliant, in several senses, perception, and incredibly valuable to get a hold of.
Yes, and I don't. Sorry to interrupt, Mark. I don't mean to imply in any way that it's not valid to seek objects and relationships and experiences. Of course, it is. I'm just implying that we shouldn't seek happiness in them. We should find our happiness in the only place where it resides, which is our being, and then seek to share that and express that and communicate that through activities, relationships, and so on. So this is not it's not a path of renunciation. It's not a denial of desire. No, in a way, desire is liberated. It's used in the service of happiness.
That's a really important, I think, what you said, because it also, in my mind, it takes me to discussion, stroke disagreement, and dialectic and so on, because I think that, again, another thing which in a cantankerous culture like ours often seems to be that gets forgotten is that there can be a discussion that includes disagreement, but that is in the service of revealing the deeper light that can shine through the disagreement. Dante gets this in a wonderful bit of the Divine Comedy, actually, where he gets to the heaven of the sun, which is sort of the brightest light that mortal eyes can see, if you like, before moving more squarely into paradisal sight. But he meets in the heaven of the sun figures on earth who disagreed really profoundly, so much so they declared each other's heretics and stuff like that, which in the medieval world was a pretty serious business. But what they realize in the heaven of the sun is that their disagreement could reveal to them the light of the divine sun, and so becomes a kind of joyful spiral upwards, not an interlocking of horns, but it does require that sense of desire which you're outlining there. In the service of a greater perception.
Yes, exactly. And imagine politics. Two politicians from the opposite side of the political spectrum. Imagine if both these politicians understood and felt that they shared their essential being. That they were essentially the same being, the same person, ultimately. But of course, their minds are very different. And at the level of their minds, they have two very different views about, for instance, how society should be organized and run. So there can still be these different views. There could still be arguments about the best way to run social services and the economy and the health service and everything. But it would the conversation would be informed by that this deep sense of their shared being, so that the conversation, even the argument, would be in service of truth. And it does require some discussion, how to run the economy or the health service. And not all minds are going to agree. It's something that is worthy of discussion, but their discussion would be in the service of truth. It wouldn't be in the service of two egos battling together with each other in order to aggrandize themselves or enhance themselves or defend themselves. So yes, that there can be disagreement, there can be argument if necessary. But it's informed by this deeper understanding, and therefore, as you say, even the argument is in service of truth.
And I think that you feel that somehow. There's something about the quality of a conversation where you feel that when your heart is growing rather than maybe feeling embattled, embittered, and so on, that there can be a guide in that, can't it? Yes. Yeah. Well, this leads on to another area which I wanted to bring in. Again, if we're sort of almost, I don't know, hope building a number of facets on this, which is actually a part that's big in Blake and in Dante, and also I think in the Sufi tradition too, again, which is actually the role of the erotic. You mentioned desire there, and I think that, again, there's another way in which it's often misunderstood. The erotic is the desire to have and to hold, to possess, to secure, to use for your pleasure, if you like. But there is a divine erotic, which is much more about, well, Blake's rather wonderful word is commingling, but you get it in Dante, where laughter and smiles and playfulness is such a feature of the paradise. There can be joshing, and Dante actually learns of people that made mistakes in love, in life. He meets particularly the wonderful figure of Cunitza, who she was known to have had 4 husbands and many lovers and things, and he's a bit surprised to meet her in paradise. But what he sees that she had was that through her mistakes, there was the genuine desire to love life, if you like. And so that playfulness and that laughter now shines through their encounter in heaven. But yeah, another sort of facet of this that can help us, if there's a kind of open, expansive playfulness that can even take risks, because it knows that everyone will fall onto life itself, if you like, or be held, never lose touch with life itself. It's a subtle business, and I think it's one of these things which you perhaps inevitably learn by some mistakes, but feels important for making this path useful to our culture, and appealing, attractive, itself desirable, not some kind of puritanical constraints, but quite the opposite, actually.
Yes, I think the whole this whole idea of the puritanical restraint and the guilt that surrounds erotic desire and sexuality, it comes from a divorcing of God from the body, thinking that that God is some abstract spirit, and the body is a kind of fallen condition made out of something other than God's presence, called matter, and that it really needs to be denied if one is going to go towards God's presence. And actually, I think that in erotic desire, ultimately, is our desire to merge. It's really a desire to lose our separate identity. Although traditionally sexual desire is considered a sin, something opposed to, contrary to our love of God or our love of truth. On the contrary, I feel that it's a way that almost everybody, it's an impulse that almost everybody has to merge with the other, and in doing so to lose their sense of being a separate entity, because that's what happens when you merge not just emotionally, but physically with another. You lose your sense of boundaries. That's what sexual intimacy is, a dissolving into one another, which is the dissolution or the loss of separation. And I think that this impulse to be divested of one's sense of separation is the deep impulse behind sexual desire. Of course, I'm not suggesting that the ego, the sense of separation, does not also appropriate sexual desire and use it to control, to manipulate, for power, and etc. Of course, this is also true. I'm talking about the deepest, the deepest origin of sexual desire, which I would suggest is a desire for union, which is a desire to be divested of our limitations and to stand revealed as eternal being. And again, it's why in the Tantric traditions, and of course for William Blake, sexuality was not considered sinful. It was not considered his illustration of Albion Rose. I'm sure you know that illustration. This young man and just spread wide open, stark naked, with a halo, with light emanating from his entire body, not just from his head, as the traditional Christian halo is a head where the sphere of light surrounds the head. This is light emanating from the entire body. And the body is wide open and naked. So it's a beautiful. This etching is a beautiful expression of the body as a representation of the divine.
Yeah,
emanation. A place where the divine can be experienced. So sorry, Mark.
Yeah, no. I'm just emanation is again such a good Blakean word, and it's when the body radiates with the divine light, emanates the divine light, and is seen in that way, rather than an object for some kind of personal satisfaction.
Yes.
Do you think? Do you think this distinction? Oh, sorry.
No. Go on.
Well, do you think this distinction is useful as well? Because I confess that the psychotherapist in me is a little nervous of words like merger, because I think it can be misunderstood. It can be a sense of sort of bypassing or returning, regressing. I mean, this was the famous criticism that Freud had of religion, that he thought that ultimately it was a desire to return to the merger of the womb. And so he saw it as infantile and regressive. So it's, and I'm sure you don't think that at all, but it can be in our kind of collective consciousness a bit like that. Whereas I think what this is about, and well, to draw on another wonderful common Sufi expression, which is, I think this is right, it's something like, wherever you turn, there is the divine face. Yes. And so it's seeing that, again, this sort of unity that's a kind of emanating diversity, and that is what sort of standing in love might be about, rather than falling in love. That's another distinction that sometimes psychotherapists make, that there's this moment where you awaken to love and you have all the thrill of romance, and that's falling in love, but it's not a very sustainable state of affairs. So they talk about moving to standing in love, which is seeing a different kind of intimacy. It's realizing that two become one, not because of the regressive kind of merger, but that two become one because they awaken to what's fully themselves in each other.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. That it's a recognition of our shared being. We're not going back to a pre-egoic state. We're evolving beyond the state of separation, and recognizing that what seems to be other than or separate from ourself is only separate in appearance. and that behind that appearance is the being that stands behind that appearance is the same being for everyone and everything, and that's how I define love, as the recognition of our shared being. And with people and animals, we tend to call it love, but the same experience with nature and objects we refer to as beauty. So in both cases, the experiences of love in relation to animals and people, and the experience of beauty in relation to objects and nature is this collapse of the sense of separation and the shining of our shared being. I think this is what the Sufis mean. Wherever you look, there is the face of God. That although it wherever we look appears to be other, that apparent otherness is an expression of God's being, the being that we share, the only being that there is, and everyone and everything is an appearance of that. So we literally, as the Sufis say, we see God everywhere. We see through appearances. It's not. When I say, I don't really mean through appearances as if reality were somehow behind appearances. But when we look at each other's face on the screen now, we don't see through each other's face to the screen. We see the face as the screen. So it's not even that reality is somehow buried behind appearances. We only suggested it is behind appearances in the early stages, when we credit appearances with their own independent existence. If we think that appearances are real in their own right, then to begin with, it suggested that reality is somehow behind them, but it's not behind them. It is shining as those very appearances. And it is possible, just as it is possible for you and I to see each other's face and to see the screen at the same time. They're not two mutually exclusive experiences. So it's possible, as the Sufis say, to experience 10,000 things as the face of the one reality.
Yeah, and it's actually what we experience all day, every day. But
it's what we experience all day, every day.
Yeah.
Because exactly, how would it be possible to experience anything other than reality? How would it be possible to have an unreal experience? There's no such thing as an unreal experience. Even when we dream of a Caribbean beach, it's still a real experience. So yes, you're absolutely right. Reality is all that is ever experienced. It's all that could ever be experienced, because there is only that which is real.
So it reminds me actually of Wittgenstein's remark that when we meet as souls, by which he means, in a way, the Blakean image of Albion Rose, like that. That is
absolutely.
If you didn't actually meet someone as a soul, then it would be a very bleak world indeed. Yes. Actually,
yes, yeah. Exactly the same as Rumi. True friends never really meet; they are in each other all along. It's Rumi's version of Wittgenstein. Yes, it's the same. When we really meet, any friendship, that's what friendship is. That this felt sense that behind our apparent differences, we are one. We share our being.
I wondered too about the role of the imagination in this. Again, it's a kind of tricky word because it can mean different things, but it is a big part of both Bob Blake. He talks of Jesus, the imagination being the place where the human and the divine are seen to be one. But it's big too in the Sufi tradition, as I understand it.
Yes.
And I feel it's a helpful thing to talk about, because if we realize that our imagination is a faculty we have to cleanse the doors of perception, to step into this wider realization and see the divine face, testing it out, maybe. The almost contemporary of Blake, Coleridge, made a very nice distinction, I think, when he said that there's a kind of fantasy when actually we're just playing with our own inner imaginings, And we know that because they might amuse us, they might sort of fill a moment in the day, but they don't really take us anywhere. They kind of fall as quickly as they rise. Whereas imagination proper for Coleridge, we realize that it helped us to step more and more into a perception of reality that's true. But cultivating and allowing yourself to play a bit with the imagination and I don't know, wonder what it might be like to look around and see the face of God looking back at you.
Yes.
That kind of quality seems to be encouraged.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. In a way, do you think you could say this, that imagination was imagination in the sense that you are speaking of it? Imagination is the faculty with which the mind ventures out beyond the limits of the waking state into a realm of the mind that is broader or deeper than the waking state. It ventures in, or it ventures deeper into the mind, into a territory that is still within the mind, but outside the narrow compass of the waking state. So in other words, that the imagination is a faculty that we engage in the waking state that gives us access to the deeper regions of the mind, and eventually that takes us all the way through the layers of the mind to our essential self.
Yeah. And can become conscious, and so become another sort of slightly technical word that is used in, well, say a writer like Henri Corbin, the great
Yes.
writer about Ibn Arabi,
Yes.
who talks about the imaginal, which I think he means when the imagination is used to reveal more and more of reality and bring it to conscious awareness, so it becomes the norm, as it were, by which you live.
Yes, exactly. So now you're framing it the other way around. I suggested the imagination was the faculty with which we kind of go from the waking state into the deeper regions of the mind, and you're expressing it the other way, which is possibly more accurate, that it's the faculty by which we bring the deeper regions, the deeper intuitions of the mind out from obscurity into the waking state and give them some kind of a form. Yes. A courier, in a way. The imagination is a kind of courier from the deeper regions of our mind into the waking state, bringing into the waking state deeper knowledge of reality that lies in our minds, but is normally inaccessible during the waking state. Sort of messenger from the unseen world.
Now that's a very tremendous comment, because the other area which I wanted to tease out with you is, well, to cut to the chase, is the role of angels. Because angels feature a lot in Blake, a lot in Dante, and a lot in Sufi texts too.
Yes.
But of course, the word angel means messenger. And it's the messenger sometimes of, sometimes the angels in Plato, say Socrates' demon, give him quite seemingly trivial advice like don't turn left. But I think more significantly, the angels can be thought of as the messenger from the imagination that awakens us to vitalities, or that reality is a living intelligence. It's part of this mentality that reality is much more like, which again is part of the switch which we need to make, I think, away from more material understandings, and to know something of reality as a dynamic presence, but communication perhaps too. And hence various figures do talk about the angels, and they're linked to the imagination somehow. Well, angels inspire. A chap I'm very influenced by, O.M. Barfield, he talked about how we might have an intuition that can flower into an imagination, but then we realize it's actually inspiring us all along. It was filling us all along.
Yes.
So it becomes a new imaginal.
Yes. I think a human mind is just one of many possible types of mind that coalesce or are precipitated in infinite consciousness. And I think there are, if we visualize the divine mind, infinite consciousness, going through a series, stepping down progressively through various levels before it becomes a human mind. I think we have to be open to the possibility that there are other levels of mind that are, so to speak, prior to a human mind, less condensed than a human mind, that are, in a way, that have not emerged so far from God's being as has a human mind. Remember Wordsworth poem, trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, which is our home. And then he describes heaven lies about us in our infancy. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy, but he beholds the light and whence it flows. He sees it in his joy. And then he goes on, the youth who daily farther from the east must travel, still is nature's priest. And then he describes how eventually the adult has wandered even further from God's presence. So if we think of the human mind as a series of a kind of descent, a condensation, there must be other regions of mind that are less contracted, less condensed, more transparent to the divine mind. It's beautifully expressed in Milton. Speak, ye who best can tell, ye sons of light, angels, for ye adore him, and with songs and choral symphonies circle his throne rejoicing. Ye in heaven. He's describing this realm of angels who are still emanations from the mind of God, but are still close to God. They still circle his throne rejoicing. They haven't descended as far, they haven't traveled as far from the divine mind as has a human mind. And I think we have to be open to the possibility that there are other kinds of minds that do not appear as embodied minds like a human being. And if a human being is if a human being if a human body is what a human mind looks like from a second person perspective, then the angelic mind, the attempts in painting to depict the angelic mind would be the kind of, we're familiar with the kind of conventional depiction of an angel, which is a simplistic depiction of an angel based on our view of the human body. But it's an attempt to what would this angelic mind look like from a second person perspective? It would be full of light. And so, of course, if we as a human being trying to paint it, we paint it as a physical body. It's obviously not a physical body, but it must have some kind of body. It must have some kind of form. And I think that people like William Blake, whose minds were so open and so porous, that they were very sensitive to these regions of the mind that were not so separate, not so clearly cut off from the divine mind. And they personified them. They personified this region of the mind as angels. In the East, it's more deities and gods. They depicted the same subliminal regions of the mind as deities and gods, and likewise the early Greeks. And so I think that the whole idea of angels, if we liberate it from the idea that there are sort of cherub-like beings in some other realm at an infinite distance, that's a simplistic view. But I think if we see them as attempts to describe these deeper regions of the mind that are much closer, much less separate from the divine mind, then it makes good sense.
Yeah, no, completely. I mean, it reminds me of Blake's poem, The Angel, where he describes how the infant has this open, porous quality that can be lost because they, become cross or angry, or I think the point about that is that the wider perception is not about like spatial perception at a distance. It's this qualitative of virtuous perception that unveils the reality that always was already present.
Exactly.
Yeah, but
Yes.
so it's the way that transcendence and immanence actually comes together.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Dante has that as well when in Paradise he has to become more and more capable of the light, which is about allowing it to shine more and more fully within him, so that it doesn't kind of blast him. And I think the point about that is so that he can remain conscious, he can be aware of what's going on and not just be, as it were, swept along by some peak experience that might somehow leave him with the sense of it was tremendous, but he couldn't really say much more. And then the hierarchies of angels, as you describe, open up. And of course, hierarchy, again, can often mean for us taking something away, but the word originally in the Christian tradition, again, meant actually precisely the opposite. It was that which was bringing very close the divine energy and light. And so the different angels were seen as part of that wonderful transmission of the fullness of life. Yeah.
Yes. So the angelic realms were kind of intermediary realms between the finite human mind and the divine mind, that they.
So there was just a hint of something else which came to my mind as you were talking there, which was about, again, well, it was the Ibn Arabi's remark about how there's never any mistake. I don't think he says mistake, that sounds like a word I would use, but there's never any error in the imagination. And then he talks about journeying in life, and how even when we feel that we might be journeying away from God, deliberately, even for many these days, having turned from the divine, actually what is being discovered is the extent of divine life, because you couldn't continue to exist unless you were in the divine life. You just sort of fall out of existence altogether, as it were. And then one can turn back and journey towards the divine, and that is to an expansive gesture, because it's about realizing what one didn't understand and having that unveiled. And he even says that journeying within the divine still has this expansive quality, because then I think, and this is what perhaps links to what we were just saying there about angels, is realizing that this unfolding even within God produces myriad reflections of the divine life too. And so, this perception is that regardless if it feels like a way towards or even within, there's the potential to see all this as a constant unfolding and unveiling. Again, which feels so very distant from dominant ways of talking about these things in culture, which are so often about discarding or rejecting, turning back towards, and so on. Which, I'd love to feel that as we talk about these things, people and indeed ourselves, because one has to inhabit it and live it yourself, might become more and more alert to, and bring some kind of return realization, which figures like Blake and Dante and the Sufis knew so well. Yeah. Maybe just one more sort of final way which perhaps this can, talking about these things can help. it comes a bit from the remark about angels and the way that angels are often depicted as guides. Because I think that it's also quite striking about how myth plays such a big part in this, and myth that once more serves to open up reality to us. I mean, perhaps the most common myth, certainly in spiritual circles, that's talked about because of the influence of Jung, is the hero myth, where the point about the hero is they have to go on a real journey, and it has to be really testing in order to find the real treasure. And there's something about the test and they're becoming capable of receiving true treasure that seems important. Plato's myth of the cave is another one, which is well known. And again, when you read it, actually there's a lot in it. It's not just about, as it were, seeing the light. There's a whole series of steps about venturing towards, well, first of all, fire, which is a reflection of light, but isn't the fullness of the sun's light. But it requires courage and following what is an intuition, but not fully understood. And so again, that's quite helpful to me because it feels like it has this possibility of trying to pick the threads. Well, I say threads, of course, Blake talks about giving us a golden thread, only winding it into a ball, and it leads into Heaven's Gate built in Jerusalem's wall. Yeah, I mean, I like this idea that these myths can be really useful guides to us. I mean, I just one final thought and see what you make of this. But I mean, given your history, your previous life as a potter, maybe even craft can help people with this because it awakens them. And you know, I hope this is true. Someone who was very eminent in this field. But it awakens people to the soul within the materiality that they're working with. I was lucky enough actually to watch a potter throwing some pots just the other day, and there was something incredibly. Well, he said I said, how do you do that? And he said, well, actually, you know, it's a kind of hug. I almost embrace the clay, and then something emerges between us that brings a particular kind of form. And I felt there was something very powerful about, again, this way of life and developing the ability to be established in this way of life in all that. I said a lot there, but perhaps you could pick up
no, but you're absolutely right. It is a very powerful way of life. I was a potter for 30 years or so, and you're working with earth, fire, water. You're working in a very involved, visceral way with all the elements. And in a way, of course, I didn't formulate it to myself at the time like this, and it's best if it's not formulated. But I felt that my work as a potter, I was being drawn deeper and deeper into participation with the earth and with processes, with tools, and that I thought that I was, from the limited perspective of a person or a finite mind, you feel that you are working on the elements with tools and processes. Actually, it's not really like that. You're being drawn into a deeper and deeper participation with, and this is the thing that I loved and love about pottery, because it involves all the elements and in such a visceral way. You were being drawn into this participation with earth, fire, water, air, and it requires you have to give up something in yourself if you're going to really participate and not simply act on your material. You have to become very involved, and you it was for me it was 30 years. It was not the work I did, it was my life. It was a way of life. But in the end, I felt that I wasn't doing it to the pottery was doing it to me. It was the whole process was in charge in a way, and I was just being invited to engage and participate more and more deeply as time went on. And it feels, you stand back from time to time and you feel you're engaged in a kind of sacred process. And I'm sure that any of your listeners who are involved in making things in any way, and that I'd include writers, poets, writers, and anyone that's involved in any musicians, any kind of creativity, and therapists, because you're involved in exploring other people's minds and other people's experience. You're drawn into participation with the other or the object, and this requires a kind of loss of yourself. It requires a giving of yourself to the object or the other, and in that sense, it's a spiritual path.
Yeah, I've done just enough music to have had the experience where you kind of get over yourself.
Exactly.
And then the music feels like maybe it's speaking you or playing you
Yes.
somehow. That
Yes.
kind of, and participation is such a good word for all that. Yeah, I really like that.
Yes. I'm sure as your work as a therapist, Mark, I'm sure you're not conscious of it when you're doing it because you're focused on it. But when you stand back, something similar is happening. You're getting over yourself. You're going beyond yourself in order to participate. Really, to be sensitive, to be open to what the other is saying. You have to go beyond your own limitations.
Mm. Maybe that's been a common thread through the various areas we've covered. This sense of beyond, more, the kind of intimacy, but also the transcendent experience of things as well.
Yes, exactly. Utterly intimate, but at the same time, shedding our limitations, which enables this deeper and deeper participation in reality. Yes.
So maybe draw things to a close. Unless, is there anything else you'd like to add? I've been sort of picking things
Mark,
up.
we've covered so much. No, I think no.
So people can find more about you and your work, retreats online and face-to-face again into 2022 on your website.
Yes, it's all on lots of talks on my YouTube channel, but on my website, rupertspira.com. Yes. And as you say, just beginning to do live meetings and retreats again, which is really lovely to be seeing people face to face again.
Participating in that way.
It's a deeper layer of participation, although it's also wonderful that we can talk in this way too. Yeah,
there's something very nice about meeting like this and the triangular sense of others participating across space and time, indeed.
It's wonderful.
It's completely real too, yeah.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, no, I feel you're just right across from me on my desk, yeah.
Yeah, well, look, maybe I'll end with the quote from Blake that I began. I invoked Blake at the beginning, and maybe he's been in somewhere or other sharing in the conversation too. And then we can draw to a close. So this is again from Blake's poem Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion, right at the end after so much discussion and suffering indeed. But Blake, or Albion, hears Jesus say these words and says, "Awake, awake, O sleeper of the land of shadows. Wake, expand. I am in you and you in me. Mutual in love divine. I'm not a god afar off. I am a brother and friend. Within your bosoms I reside, and you reside in me. Lo, we are one." That is actually very nice to recite again. I feel we've touched on a lot of those themes, and they feel that bit more expansive as a result. So thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Mark. That's a marvelous quotation to start and end with. It kind of says it all, but it's been, as always, very, very enjoyable to explore what that means in various aspects of our experience. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you.